Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 4. American History. Civil Rights. Part 3. Working for Equality by Law. With the passage of the 15th Amendment, which promised male citizens of any race the right to vote, and the 19th Amendment, which promised suffrage to women alongside men, voting rights were extended to more Americans than ever before. However, discrimination was still evident in every area of U.S. society and law. One form of racial discrimination that became the focus for many American protesters during the Civil Rights Movement was segregation in schools. In the first half of the 1900s, it was very common for school systems to separate students by race. Providing citizens with an education is one of the powers and responsibilities of state governments, and states frequently differ in how they manage their school systems. In the early 20th century, state departments of education took many different stances on race and many different approaches to the issue of racial segregation in schools. Some states allowed segregation on a town-by-town basis, but did not require it. Some states outlawed segregation, and some states took the opposite stance, requiring segregation by law. Supporters of school segregation argued that although students were separated by race, they were receiving equal educational opportunities in their separate facilities. Those in favor of segregation contended that in elementary, junior high, and high school, Black school children were being taught the same subjects as white school children. Many pro-segregation state governments claimed Black schools, white schools, and Native American schools all had access to similar resources. As long as things were separate but equal, the rights of American students and teachers of all races were supposedly equally protected. In 1951, however, a group of activists sued the Board of Education of Topeka, a city in the state of Kansas, to end school segregation. The group suing the board argued that the idea that any school system can be separate but equal is pure fiction. The case was controversial in lower courts. Eventually, it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Since school segregation occurred throughout the United States, not just in Kansas, the issue was deemed relevant to the entire nation. In the case of Brown versus Board of Education, civil rights activists pointed out that in reality, schools for white children consistently had access to better funding and to many more essential resources than did schools for Black children. In 1954, the Supreme Court came to a unanimous decision. All 9 justices agreed that educational opportunity is a fundamental right of U.S. citizens and that the Constitution requires state governments to protect the right to education for all their citizens equally, regardless of race. All 9 justices also agreed that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. As such, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation of public schools is unconstitutional. Once the Supreme Court's decision was announced, all the state laws requiring segregation in public schools were declared invalid. The court had decided those laws went against the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. The federal government started making plans for desegregation of public schools throughout the country. Civics test question. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? To provide schooling and education. States have the power and the responsibility to provide their citizens with an education. Though states can make many different decisions regarding how they will provide education, all states must abide by the U.S. Constitution. States also have the power to provide police protection, manage fire departments, give driver's licenses, and approve zoning and land use. Civics test question. How many justices are on the Supreme Court? How many justices are on the Supreme Court? 9. There are 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. In the case of Brown v. Board of Education, all 9 justices were of the same opinion. Their decision was unanimous. Despite the Supreme Court's decision, which applied to all of the United States, segregated school systems were very slow to acknowledge the ruling. It took years for the town of Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, to very reluctantly make arrangements for a handful of African American students to enroll in what had been up to that moment an exclusively white high school. There were 9 black high school students registered at the Little Rock Central High School. They became known throughout the nation as the Little Rock Nine when their situation made national news thanks to pushback from the Arkansas government. When the Little Rock Nine tried to go to class as scheduled, Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, called on the National Guard to stop the students from entering the school. Governors of states have the power to direct the National Guard to assist the public in serious emergencies. In Governor Faubus's view, allowing 9 black students into an otherwise all-white school would create an emergency. After the federal government overrode Governor Faubus's orders, the governor had the high school closed down entirely. For a time, there were no high school classes at all in Little Rock. Some teachers filmed lessons to air on local TV, but not all families in town had a television set. During this period, because of the governor's actions, many teenagers in Little Rock were simply cut off from education. By going against the Supreme Court's ruling, Governor Faubus was behaving as if he were above the law. He was choosing to ignore a basic principle of U.S. government, the rule of law. The rule of law states that everyone must obey the law, including leaders and members of government. No one is above the law, not even state governors. Civics test question. What is the rule of law? What is the rule of law? Everyone must follow the law. The rule of law means that everyone must follow the law. Leaders must obey the law. The government must obey the law. No one is above the law. When the governor of Arkansas refused to accept the Supreme Court's ruling about school segregation, he came into political conflict with Dwight D. Eisenhower. For many years, Eisenhower had been an officer in the military, rising to the rank of general during World War II. When the United States joined the fight against Italy, Germany, and Japan in the Second World War, General Eisenhower helped direct troop movements in Europe. After the war, Eisenhower was elected President of the United States. The President of the United States is also the Commander-in-Chief of the military. Eisenhower won the presidential election partly because many American voters believed his wartime experience made him a strong candidate for Commander-in-Chief. In addition to acting as Commander-in-Chief, the President is the head of the executive branch of government. This means the President has the job of enforcing the law, or making sure it gets followed. When Governor Faubus went against the Supreme Court's decision and tried to stop desegregation in Little Rock, President Eisenhower had the duty to step in and enforce the law. As head of the executive branch of government, he needed to take action against unconstitutional behavior. In his role as commander-in-chief of the military, Eisenhower took command of the Arkansas National Guard. He told the soldiers of the Guard to stand down, and he replaced them with different federal troops. The new soldiers, under the president's orders, escorted the Little Rock Nine safely to class day after day. Throughout the school year, these students faced constant harassment and threats of violence, not only from white classmates, but also from those classmates' parents and other white adults of the town. When the governor of Arkansas continued to try to prevent desegregation by shutting down high schools altogether, the federal government had to take further action to reopen the schools. For many years, there were protests and counter-protests throughout Arkansas as people argued about racial discrimination in schools. Civics test question. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? World War II. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general in World War II. Civics test question. Who is the commander-in-chief of the military? Who is the commander-in-chief of the military? The President. The President is the commander-in-chief of the military. Civics test question. Who is in charge of the executive branch? Who is in charge of the executive branch? The President. The President is in charge of the executive branch of U.S. federal government and has the job of enforcing laws. Although it took many years, eventually all high schools in Little Rock desegregated. In many other cities, it took much longer, but one by one, the high schools of the American South began to integrate their classrooms. Elementary schools desegregated after high schools. In 1960, Ruby Bridges of Louisiana became the first Black child in a southern state to enroll in a previously all-white elementary school. U.S. Marshals were assigned to escort her to class. Even though Bridges was only a small child, she was viewed as a threat by pro-segregationists and needed to be protected from racist attacks. Despite the often violent pushback, eventually all public schools throughout the USA officially desegregated. Students were no longer separated by law on the basis of race. Ending the segregation of public schools was an important achievement of the civil rights movement, but school segregation was just one of countless forms of racial discrimination in the United States. In many states, segregation outside of the classroom continued to be enforced throughout the workforce, in access to public services like banking and transportation, and in the use of public spaces like restaurants, parks, and restrooms. In some states, interracial marriage was still illegal, and in many states, citizens had to pay a poll tax before they would be allowed to vote. Since most Black Americans at the time did not have a large inheritance, and many did not even have a livable income, paying a poll tax was frequently difficult or impossible. Partly for that reason, Black people were in general less likely to vote than white people. Housing was also a huge issue, since in many parts of the U.S., Black people were not allowed to rent or buy property in neighborhoods dominated by white people. Affordable housing opportunities were often much more restricted for Black Americans than for white Americans, in the north of the country as well as the south. Because of these problems and more, protesters continued to find ways to petition the government for change throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Civil rights movement activists used newspapers to make their opinions public, gave speeches, organized boycotts, appealed to the Supreme Court, marched in demonstrations, and found other ways to make their voices heard. One of the most well-known civil rights movement protesters during this period was a Black church leader named Martin Luther King Jr. In Alabama and in other southern states, Martin Luther King Jr. helped organize and carry out demonstrations for voting rights that made national headlines. He convinced enormous groups of people to participate in boycotts of public services and businesses that enforced segregation, putting pressure on employers and business owners to desegregate their franchises. He spoke out against racial discrimination on the radio and on TV, and campaigned for equality in many other ways. Throughout his life, Martin Luther King Jr. fought for civil rights. He is remembered today as someone who tirelessly worked for equality of all Americans. Although he did not use violence as a means of protest, King was arrested and jailed multiple times by authorities who viewed him as a dangerous influence. Despite the danger in which he frequently found himself as a prominent figure of the civil rights movement, King never stopped fighting to end racial discrimination. Much as women's suffrage activists had marched on Washington, D.C. to demonstrate for voting rights in 1913, King and thousands of other Americans processed into the capital city in 1963 to demand an end to racial discrimination at the polls, in the workplace, and in the housing market. During the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial, inspiring listeners to keep on working for equality for all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or national origin. Later, in the very last public speech he ever gave, King reminded his audience that participants in the civil rights movement were doing nothing unconstitutional by protesting. In fact, they were exercising their First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, as they petitioned the government to put an end to racial discrimination and give U.S. citizens of all races equal access to civil rights. King declared that threats of arrest, police dogs, or other forms of police violence were not going to stop protesters from fighting for their rights. Here's a small part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s final public speech.
Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights. We aren't going to let dogs or water hoses turn us around. We are going on.
The day after he made this speech, King was assassinated. His death did not stop other civil rights movement protesters from continuing to work for equality for all Americans, however. King's example inspired many to continue the fight. Civics test question. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? Fought for civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for civil rights and worked for equality for all Americans. The work of Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists in the 1900s convinced Congress to create some important new laws. For one thing, thanks to the civil rights movement, an amendment was added to the Constitution prohibiting poll taxes. Today, because of Martin Luther King Jr. and his fellow protesters, citizens of the United States never have to pay to vote. Civil rights movement campaigns also led Congress to pass some bills meant to help protect equal rights in other ways. Campaigners' highly publicized protests put pressure on the president to sign those bills into law. Shortly after the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes, Congress put through a bill known as the Civil Rights Act. In 1964, the president signed the Civil Rights Act into law, prohibiting all segregation and other forms of discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. The next year, Congress passed a bill called the Voting Rights Act. The president signed this bill into law immediately, too. The Voting Rights Act specifically addressed attempts by state and local governments to racially restrict participation at the polls. Despite the 15th Amendment statement that African American citizens had as much of a right to vote as white citizens, many districts had long tried to find ways around the rules by putting policies in place that made it difficult for Black citizens to register to vote. A part of the Voting Rights Act was later overruled, but the immediate effect of the law was to shut down many underhanded attempts by state and local governments to deny Black Americans the right to vote. Literacy tests unfairly designed to block certain groups of voters from registering were no longer allowed. Federal officers were assigned to voting districts to supervise the registration process and to ensure that Black Americans were not being harassed or turned away when they tried to take part. In the 4 months immediately after the president signed the Voting Rights Act into law, 250,000 Black Americans successfully registered to vote for the first time. In addition to problems of racial discrimination in voting, equal access to affordable housing was still a huge issue. Civil rights movement protests often highlighted the unequal housing opportunities of Americans of different races. Protesters pushed Congress to address the situation by creating another Civil Rights Act in 1968. When the president signed this act into law, it became illegal in the United States to discriminate by race in the sale, rental, or financing of housing. Since the time they were passed, these acts have been updated in certain ways and continue to impact how Americans live today. For example, in the 1980s, the Act about Housing was updated to also outlaw discrimination against people with disabilities or against families with children. Civics test question: who signs bills to become laws? Who signs bills to become laws? The President. When the President signs a bill that has been passed by both the Senate and the House of Representatives, the bill becomes law. Since the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, several political milestones have been reached that illustrate how the United States is changing, thanks to the work of Americans who fought to end sexual and racial discrimination in their country. For instance, for a very long time, all justices of the Supreme Court were white men. Supreme Court justices are appointed by the President and approved by the Senate, and before the Civil Rights Movement, all the justices presidentially appointed and congressionally approved had been white. As Civil Rights Movement protesters pushed for better educational opportunities and more representation in government, however, prevailing attitudes about who could be on the Supreme Court began to change. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first African American to be appointed by the President and approved by the Senate as a justice of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall had a long court career before his appointment, including arguing before the Supreme Court in the Brown v. Board of Education case that ruled racial segregation of public schools unconstitutional, effectively ending the practice by law in the United States. As a Supreme Court justice, Marshall served in the highest court of the United States for more than 20 years. While at the start of the 1900s, most women of any race and most Black men were prevented from voting nationwide, When laws were made to change this situation, the racial and sexual makeup of Americans' elected representation in the Senate and the House started to change too. In 1969, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman in Congress. She served in the House of Representatives for a New York congressional district and was re-elected several times. In 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman to serve as a Supreme Court justice. Political milestones have also been reached by elections and government appointments in the 2000s, showing that social norms and expectations in U.S. government and politics have continued to shift and evolve in the present century. In 2007, a woman was made Speaker of the House for the first time in history when Nancy Pelosi's fellow representatives in Congress chose her for the role. 2 years later, a Black candidate won the U.S. presidential election for the first time. Barack Obama, whose mother was white and whose father was Black, was elected twice as President of the United States. He served as Commander-in-Chief of the military and head of the executive branch for 8 years total. In 2021, the United States had its first woman vice president when Kamala Harris, whose parents were of African and South Asian descent, was sworn in. While historical milestones like these do not mean that there is no longer any reason for Americans to petition the government or fight for political and social change, they are a demonstration of how different the situation in U.S. government is today when compared to past centuries. Thanks to thousands of Americans who fought for civil rights over the course of this country's history, there are fewer limitations by race and by sex, among other considerations, than there used to be on who can vote and on who can serve in the executive branch, judicial branch, and legislative branch of the U.S. government. Civics test question. Name one branch or part of the government. Name one branch or part of the government. Congress. Congress is one part of the government. There are 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Each of these branches has many parts, including the office of the president and the courts. The civil rights movement is a part of 20th century history, but it wasn't long ago. Many activists who took part in the protests and other pushes for change described in this lesson are alive today. There are still lots of people in the United States who remember participating in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom and other civil rights protests of the 1950s and 1960s. There are also still many Americans with memories of going to school in segregated classrooms and of fighting against racial discrimination with regard to housing opportunities. People who took part in the civil rights movement continue to fight for civil rights even now by voting, writing to newspapers, running for office, and helping with campaigns. They and millions of younger Americans participate in their democracy today in many of the ways Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues did in the 1900s. Civics test question. What are 2 ways that Americans can participate in their democracy? What are 2 ways that Americans can participate in their democracy? Vote and help with a campaign. There are many ways that Americans can participate in their democracy. Voting is a key way citizens 18 and older can have an impact on the activities of their local, state, and federal government. But Americans of any age can take part in the democratic process by helping with a campaign, joining a civic group, joining a community group, or giving an elected official their opinion on an issue. By joining a political party, Americans can have more of a say in what specific organizations like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party do. Whether they are affiliated with a specific party or not, Americans can share their opinion with government officials by calling senators or representatives, or by publicly supporting or opposing an issue or policy. Only U.S. citizens can run for federal office, but according to the First Amendment to the Constitution, which promises freedom of the press, anyone in the U.S. can participate in American democracy by writing to a newspaper. This is the end of Lesson 4 of Citizenship on the Go.